The winter of 1903 was the harshest in living memory when the Tolliver family first arrived in Blackwood County, Tennessee. They came carrying nothing but worn carpetbags and a reputation that preceded them like smoke from a funeral pyre. The local postmaster wrote in his diary that evening, "The Tollivers have come to our mountains, and God help us all." He wasn't being dramatic. 5 families had already packed their belongings and fled the county before the Tollivers even finished building their first cabin. What makes a family name become synonymous with terror? What transforms ordinary people into something so sinister that entire communities abandon their homes rather than share the same valley? The Tolliver bloodline carried secrets that stretched back centuries, traditions so dark that even today, genealogists refuse to trace their family tree beyond a certain point. Federal records from 3 different states contain files on the Tollivers that remain classified, their contents deemed too disturbing for public consumption. The story I'm about to tell you isn't found in any history textbook. It's been deliberately buried, just like many of the people who crossed paths with this infamous clan. But the truth has a way of surfacing, especially when that truth involves practices so macabre they challenge our understanding of human nature itself. The Tolliver legacy spans over 2 centuries of documented horror, weaving through the darkest chapters of American history like a thread dyed in blood. What you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you view the isolated communities of Appalachia. These aren't folklore tales or mountain legends passed down through generations of storytellers. These are documented events, witnessed accounts, and physical evidence that law enforcement agencies have spent decades trying to suppress. The Tolliver family didn't just commit crimes, they perfected them. They turned brutality into an art form and made terror their family business. The mountains of Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia still bear the scars of their presence. Local residents speak in hushed tones about certain hollows where nothing grows, about springs that run red during heavy rains, about the sound of children crying that echoes from abandoned homesteads on windless nights. These aren't superstitions. They're the lingering remnants of a family that understood how to weaponize fear itself. But here's what makes the Tolliver story truly chilling. They weren't random killers driven by passion or desperation. Every action they took was calculated, methodical, and served a purpose within a larger framework that spanned generations. They maintained detailed records of their activities, kept meticulous genealogical charts, and followed traditions that had been passed down through their bloodline for centuries. The Tollivers weren't just criminals, they were preservationists of practices so ancient and horrific that they predated written history. The first official record of Tolliver activities dates back to 1847, when a circuit judge in eastern Kentucky noted in his journal that an entire family had vanished from their homestead overnight. The Hendersons had been well-respected members of their community, but they'd made the mistake of filing a land dispute against their neighbors, the Tollivers. When the sheriff arrived to investigate, he found the Henderson cabin empty, except for a single item left deliberately on the kitchen table. A small wooden doll with human hair, its face carved into an expression of perpetual screaming. This became the Tolliver signature. They didn't just eliminate their enemies, they sent messages. They wanted survivors to know exactly who was responsible, and to understand that crossing the Tolliver family carried consequences that extended far beyond simple violence. The wooden dolls began appearing throughout the region, always in homes where the occupants had mysteriously disappeared. Each doll was unique, carved with obsessive attention to detail, and authorities noticed that the facial features always matched those of the missing persons. By 1855, the Tolliver influence had spread across 3 states. They'd established a network of remote cabins connected by hidden trails that only family members knew how to navigate. These weren't simple homesteads. They were fortified compounds designed to withstand sieges, equipped with escape tunnels, hidden weapon caches, and holding areas for captives. The family had evolved from isolated mountain dwellers into something resembling a medieval clan, complete with their own laws, customs, and methods of justice. What distinguished the Tollivers from other notorious families of the era was their organizational structure. They operated like a corporation, with clearly defined roles and responsibilities passed down through bloodlines. The eldest male served as patriarch, making strategic decisions and maintaining relationships with corrupt officials. The women managed the domestic operations, including the preservation of family traditions and the education of children in their unique customs. Even the youngest members had specific duties, beginning their training in family practices before they could walk. The family's wealth grew exponentially during this period, though the source of their prosperity remained mysterious. They owned vast tracts of land despite having no visible means of income. They purchased supplies with gold coins when their neighbors struggled to afford basic necessities. Merchants reported that Tolliver women always paid for goods with currency that seemed unusually old, sometimes bearing mint marks from decades past or featuring designs that didn't match any known American coinage. Local authorities began investigating the family's finances in 1862, but the inquiry was abruptly terminated when 3 investigators disappeared within a single week. Their bodies were never found, but their horses were discovered tied to trees near Tolliver property, each animal bearing a small wooden doll tied to its saddle. The message was clear. The Tollivers operated beyond the reach of conventional law enforcement. The Civil War provided the perfect cover for the family's activities. With official attention focused on the conflict, the Tollivers expanded their operations dramatically. They established themselves as suppliers to both Union and Confederate forces, selling information, weapons, and safe passage through their territory. But their true business during this period was far more sinister. They began accepting contracts for eliminations, specializing in making people disappear without leaving evidence that could be traced back to their employers. Military records from both armies contain references to the Tolliver family, though these documents are heavily redacted. What remains suggests that commanding officers on both sides were aware of the family's activities, but chose to utilize their services rather than confront them. The Tollivers had become too useful to eliminate, too dangerous to ignore, and too well connected to prosecute. The most disturbing aspect of their wartime activities involved their treatment of deserters. Soldiers who abandoned their posts and fled into the mountains often found themselves in Tolliver territory, where they were offered sanctuary in exchange for information about troop movements and supply lines. Those who accepted the deal were never seen again. Those who refused faced immediate execution. But the Tollivers didn't simply kill deserters, they collected them, keeping detailed records of each man's identity, unit, and personal history. After the war ended, families throughout the region began receiving packages containing personal effects of their missing relatives. A pocket watch here, a wedding ring there, always accompanied by a small wooden doll and a note demanding payment for services rendered. The Tollivers had been harvesting the belongings of dead soldiers throughout the conflict, creating an inventory of leverage they could use against grieving families for decades to come. This practice of collecting trophies from victims became a cornerstone of Tolliver operations. They maintained vast storage areas filled with personal items taken from people who had crossed their path. These weren't random souvenirs. Each item was carefully cataloged with detailed information about its original owner, the circumstances of their death, and the location of their remains. The family used this information to maintain psychological control over entire communities, always able to prove their responsibility for unsolved disappearances. The post-war period marked the beginning of the Tolliver family's golden age. They'd accumulated enough wealth and influence to operate with virtual impunity, and their reputation for brutality had grown to legendary proportions. Entire towns would empty when word spread that the Tollivers were traveling through the area. Merchants would close their shops, families would bar their doors, and local officials would suddenly find urgent business that required them to be elsewhere. But the family's success bred ambition, and their activities grew increasingly bold. They began targeting not just individuals, but entire communities that posed threats to their interests. The massacre at Willow Creek in 1871 stands as perhaps the most horrific example of their capabilities. The small mining town had discovered rich coal deposits on land the Tollivers claimed as their own. Rather than pursue legal remedies, the family chose a more direct approach. On a foggy October morning, residents of Willow Creek woke to find their town surrounded by armed figures wearing masks carved from human skulls. The siege lasted 3 days, during which the Tollivers systematically eliminated anyone who attempted to flee or resist. By the 4th day, Willow Creek was a ghost town, its buildings intact, but its population vanished. The only evidence of what had occurred was a massive pile of wooden dolls stacked in the town square, each one bearing the carved likeness of a former resident. The Willow Creek massacre should have brought overwhelming law enforcement attention, but instead, it was covered up by officials who feared the consequences of confronting the Tolliver family directly. The town was officially declared abandoned due to a mining accident, and all records of its population were sealed. The cover-up worked so well that today most historians are unaware that Willow Creek ever existed. This pattern of violence, followed by official suppression, became the Tolliver family's standard operating procedure. They'd grown powerful enough to influence judges, sheriffs, and even federal marshals. Their network of corruption extended throughout the region, ensuring that their activities would never be properly investigated or prosecuted. They'd essentially created their own sovereign territory within the United States, a kingdom of terror ruled by blood and maintained through fear. The family's influence reached its peak during the 1880s when they controlled an estimated 200,000 acres across 3 states. Their territory included dozens of small communities, all of which paid tribute to the Tolliver patriarch in exchange for protection. This wasn't protection from outside threats. It was protection from the Tollivers themselves. Communities that paid their tribute were left alone. Those that resisted faced the same fate as Willow Creek. But the Tolliver Empire contained the seeds of its own destruction. The family's success had made them arrogant, and their arrogance led them to make a fatal mistake. In 1889, they targeted the daughter of a prominent railroad executive, believing they could extract a massive ransom without consequences. They'd underestimated both the father's resources and his determination to see justice done. The executive hired a private army of investigators and mercenaries, men who weren't bound by the same constraints that had hampered official law enforcement. These professionals began systematically documenting Tolliver activities, mapping their territory, and identifying their sources of support. For the first time in decades, the family found themselves facing opponents who couldn't be intimidated or corrupted. The war between the Tollivers and their pursuers lasted 3 years, playing out across the mountains of Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia. It was a conflict fought in shadows, with both sides employing tactics that would have been considered war crimes in any official military engagement. The Tollivers used their knowledge of the terrain and their network of supporters to launch devastating guerrilla attacks. Their opponents responded with superior firepower and relentless pressure that gradually wore down the family's resources. The final confrontation came in the winter of 1892 when the mercenaries surrounded the main Tolliver compound during a blizzard. The siege lasted 2 weeks, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. But the investigators had learned from previous failures. They'd cut off all escape routes and brought enough supplies to outlast their enemies. The Tollivers were trapped, and they knew it. Rather than surrender, the family chose to follow a tradition that had been passed down through their bloodline for generations. They set fire to their compound, destroying centuries of accumulated wealth and evidence of their activities. The flames burned for 3 days, visible from miles away, sending a column of black smoke into the winter sky that locals described as resembling a funeral pyre for the entire clan. When the investigators finally entered the smoldering ruins, they found no bodies. The Tollivers had vanished as completely as their victims, leaving behind only ashes and the lingering smell of burned flesh. Some claimed the family had escaped through hidden tunnels. Others insisted they'd perished in the flames. But the truth was more disturbing than either theory suggested. The Tolliver family hadn't died. They'd simply disappeared, melting back into the mountains like smoke dissipating in the wind. Their organized empire was destroyed, but individual family members had scattered throughout the region, taking their knowledge and traditions with them. The Tolliver name might have been discredited, but the bloodline survived, and with it, the practices that had made them so feared. As the 19th century dawned, the surviving remnants of the Tolliver clan emerged from their mountain exile, fundamentally transformed. The fire of 1892 had not destroyed them, it had forged them into something far more dangerous. While the world beyond their hidden territories modernized with railroads and telegraph lines, the Tollivers retreated deeper into practices that predated civilization itself. The family's patriarch, Ezekiel Tolliver, had survived the compound's destruction by fleeing to a network of caves his ancestors had prepared decades earlier. These weren't mere hiding places, but sanctuaries where the family's most sacred and terrible rituals were preserved. Deep within the limestone chambers, carved symbols covered every surface, their meanings known only to those who shared the Tolliver bloodline. By 1895, scattered reports began filtering out of the Kentucky mountains. Travelers spoke of abandoned settlements where entire families had vanished overnight, leaving behind only empty cabins and livestock that refused to be approached. The pattern was always the same. No signs of struggle, no bodies, just the lingering scent of something metallic and wrong that made horses refuse to enter the areas. What investigators didn't understand was that the Tollivers had evolved beyond simple violence. The trauma of their near extinction had awakened something primal in their bloodline, a hunger that went beyond territory or wealth. They had begun practicing what they called the calling, a ritual that allowed them to influence the thoughts and actions of those who crossed their path. The process was methodical and terrifying. Family members would position themselves along mountain trails, remaining hidden while whispering in a dialect that seemed to bypass the ears entirely. Travelers would find themselves inexplicably drawn to leave the safety of established paths, wandering deeper into the wilderness until they reached predetermined locations where the real work began. These locations were always the same, circular clearings where the trees grew in unnatural patterns, their branches intertwining overhead to block out the sky. At the center of each clearing stood a collection of stones arranged in precise geometric patterns, their surfaces worn smooth by generations of use. Here, the Tollivers would conduct their most sacred ceremony, one that bound the victim to their will permanently. The ritual required specific elements: water from springs that never saw sunlight, herbs that grew only in soil enriched by decay, and most importantly, willing participation from the victim. This last requirement was the most disturbing aspect of the Tolliver methods. Through their whispered influence, they convinced their captives that joining the family was not just desirable, but necessary for their survival. Those who underwent the calling emerged fundamentally changed. Their eyes developed a peculiar luminescence in darkness. Their hearing became supernaturally acute, and they gained an uncanny ability to navigate the mountain wilderness without compass or map. More troubling, they displayed absolute loyalty to the Tolliver bloodline, abandoning their previous lives without question or regret. By 1900, the Tolliver influence had spread across 3 states through this network of converted followers. Unlike their previous crude methods of intimidation and violence, this new approach was virtually invisible. Law enforcement officers investigating disappearances would find themselves inexplicably reluctant to venture into certain areas, their reports consistently describing equipment malfunctions and an overwhelming sense of being watched. The family's leadership structure had also evolved. Rather than relying on a single patriarch, they operated through a council of elders who communicated through methods that defied conventional understanding. Family members separated by hundreds of miles could coordinate their activities with precision that suggested some form of telepathic connection. Their economic activities became more sophisticated as well. Instead of crude extortion, they established legitimate businesses that served as fronts for their true operations. Logging companies, mining ventures, and trading posts allowed them to monitor and control movement through their territories while maintaining the appearance of normal commercial activity. The most successful of these ventures was Tolliver Timber, ostensibly a family logging operation that supplied lumber to growing cities throughout the region. What customers didn't know was that every piece of wood carried with it something extra. The timber was processed in mills where certain rituals were performed, imbuing the material with properties that affected those who lived in structures built from it. Families who moved into homes constructed with Tolliver lumber reported strange phenomena. Children who claimed to hear voices from the walls, adults who experienced vivid dreams of mountain landscapes they'd never seen, and an inexplicable compulsion to travel to specific locations in the Appalachian wilderness. These effects were subtle enough to be dismissed as coincidence or imagination, but they served the family's purposes perfectly. The Tollivers had learned that true power came not from fear, but from influence so subtle that victims never realized they were being manipulated. Their wooden dolls, once crude calling cards left at crime scenes, evolved into sophisticated talismans that could affect human behavior across vast distances. Each doll was carved from trees that had grown in soil mixed with specific organic materials, seasoned in caves where the family's ancestors had performed their darkest rituals, and finished with oils extracted from plants that grew only in the deepest mountain hollows. The carving process itself was a sacred act, performed only during specific lunar phases by family members who had undergone years of preparation. These dolls were then distributed through seemingly innocent channels, sold as folk art at trading posts, given as gifts to unsuspecting visitors, or simply left in locations where they would be discovered by curious travelers. Once in someone's possession, the dolls began their work slowly, subtly influencing the owner's thoughts and decisions. The effects were gradual but inexorable. Owners found themselves making choices that seemed perfectly logical at the time, but ultimately served the Tolliver family's interests. A merchant might decide to establish a trading route that passed through Tolliver territory. A government official might choose to reassign investigators away from certain cases. A family might suddenly feel compelled to relocate to a specific mountain community where they would be welcomed by helpful neighbors who happened to share the Tolliver bloodline. By 1905, this network of influence extended throughout the eastern United States. The family maintained detailed records of every doll's location and the status of its owner, creating a vast web of unwitting agents who furthered their goals without ever realizing they were being manipulated. The most disturbing aspect of this system was its self-perpetuating nature. Children who grew up in households with Tolliver dolls developed an affinity for the family's methods, often seeking out additional dolls or even traveling to the mountains to make direct contact with the clan. These young people became the next generation of willing converts, ensuring the family's influence would continue to spread. Local authorities, who attempted to investigate the growing number of disappearances and strange occurrences, found themselves facing obstacles that seemed to multiply with each step they took. Evidence would mysteriously vanish from secure locations. Witnesses would suddenly become reluctant to testify, and investigators themselves would experience psychological pressure that made continuing their work nearly impossible. The few officials who persisted in their investigations often met with tragic accidents. Sheriff Marcus Whitmore of Pike County, who had begun mapping the pattern of disappearances, was found dead in his office in 1903, apparently having suffered a heart attack. The coroner noted that his body showed no signs of violence, but several witnesses reported seeing strange shadows moving through the building on the night he died. Federal marshals who attempted to coordinate investigations across state lines faced similar fates. Marshal James Crawford, who had begun assembling a comprehensive case against the Tolliver network, disappeared while traveling between Kentucky and Tennessee in 1906. His horse was found 3 days later, still saddled but showing signs of extreme agitation. Crawford himself was never seen again, though local residents reported hearing his voice calling for help from deep within the forest for weeks afterward. The family's influence extended beyond law enforcement to include judges, prosecutors, and even newspaper editors who might publicize their activities. Through their network of influenced individuals, they could suppress unfavorable coverage, discredit witnesses, and ensure that any legal proceedings against them would fail. Perhaps most remarkably, the Tollivers had learned to manipulate the very landscape itself. Through rituals performed at specific locations during certain astronomical events, they could alter the behavior of local wildlife, change the flow of streams, and even influence weather patterns within their territory. Travelers who entered Tolliver-controlled areas often reported becoming lost despite following well-marked trails, finding themselves walking in circles for days while their supplies dwindled and their sanity began to fray. Those who eventually escaped described a landscape that seemed to shift and change when they weren't looking directly at it, paths that appeared and disappeared without explanation, and a constant sense of being observed by unseen watchers. The family's most ambitious project during this period was the establishment of what they called sanctuary towns, entire communities populated exclusively by those who had undergone the calling or their descendants. These settlements appeared normal to casual observers, but operated according to principles that would have horrified outsiders. In these communities, traditional concepts of individual will and personal choice were virtually non-existent. Every decision, from whom to marry to what crops to plant, was made collectively according to guidance provided by the Tolliver elders. Children were raised communally, their education focused on preparing them for their eventual role in the family's greater purpose. The most successful of these sanctuary towns was Millbrook, established in a remote valley in eastern Kentucky in 1907. To outsiders, it appeared to be a thriving agricultural community, its residents friendly and helpful to the occasional traveler who passed through. What visitors didn't realize was that every aspect of their stay was carefully orchestrated to serve the family's purposes. The town's inn was positioned so that guests would sleep in rooms where specific rituals had been performed, subtly influencing their dreams and psychological state. The local store sold goods that had been prepared according to the family's methods, creating a network of influence that extended far beyond the town's borders, as visitors carried these items back to their home communities. Most disturbing of all was the town's church, where services were conducted in a mixture of traditional Christian imagery and far older practices. The congregation would gather weekly to participate in rituals that strengthened their connection to the Tolliver bloodline while maintaining the appearance of conventional religious worship. By 1910, the Tolliver family had achieved something unprecedented in American history. They had created a shadow society that operated parallel to conventional civilization, influencing events and decisions at every level while remaining virtually invisible to those they manipulated. Their transformation from crude mountain outlaws to sophisticated puppet masters represented an evolution that would have profound implications for the decades to come. The family's success lay not in their willingness to use violence, though they remained capable of terrible brutality when necessary, but in their understanding of human psychology and their ability to exploit the fundamental weaknesses in human nature. They had learned that people would willingly surrender their freedom if the process was gradual enough and if they could be convinced that their choices were their own. As the new century progressed, the Tollivers continued to refine their methods, always adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining their core purpose. They had discovered that true power lay not in controlling territory or accumulating wealth, but in shaping the thoughts and desires of those around them. Through patience, cunning, and practices that defied rational explanation, they had positioned themselves to influence the course of American history in ways that would not be fully understood for generations to come. By the early 1900s, the Tolliver influence had evolved beyond crude intimidation tactics into something far more insidious. They had become masters of psychological manipulation, weaving themselves into the fabric of communities with such subtlety that their presence felt almost natural. Yet beneath this veneer of legitimacy, their true nature remained as dark as ever. The network they had established through their enchanted dolls was merely the beginning. What emerged in the decades following their apparent defeat was a sophisticated system of control that would make their earlier methods seem primitive by comparison. The Tollivers had learned that true power came not from fear alone, but from dependency. In the winter of 1907, a traveling merchant named Samuel Blackwood arrived in the small town of Cedar Falls, Tennessee. The town had been struggling economically for years, its once thriving lumber industry decimated by overlogging and poor management. Blackwood appeared at precisely the right moment, offering solutions that seemed too good to be true. He established a general store that somehow always had exactly what people needed, often items that should have been impossible to acquire in such a remote location. His prices were fair, his credit terms generous, and his manner so genuinely helpful that within months he had become the town's most trusted citizen. What the residents didn't realize was that Samuel Blackwood was Jeremiah Tolliver's nephew, and every transaction in his store was carefully calculated to create bonds of obligation. The merchandise itself was the key to his strategy. Each item sold had been subjected to a process the Tollivers called imprinting. Tools would work more efficiently than they should, but only when used for tasks that somehow served Tolliver interests. Medicine would cure ailments miraculously, but patients would find themselves compelled to speak favorably of the store to newcomers. Even simple household items carried subtle influences, gradually shaping the thoughts and behaviors of those who used them. The process was so gradual that no one suspected manipulation. A farmer who purchased a new plow would find his crops growing unusually well, but he would also find himself inexplicably drawn to expand his property in directions that happened to serve Tolliver land acquisition schemes. A woman who bought fabric for a dress would create garments of exceptional beauty, but she would also develop an irresistible urge to gather information about her neighbors' private affairs. Within 3 years, Cedar Falls had transformed from a dying town into a thriving community. Property values rose, businesses flourished, and the population grew as word spread of the town's remarkable prosperity. Yet beneath this success lay a web of control so intricate that the townspeople had become unwitting agents of the Tolliver agenda. The true genius of this system became apparent when a circuit judge arrived in 1910 to investigate reports of unusual occurrences in the region. Within hours of his arrival, the judge found himself bombarded with testimonials about the town's remarkable transformation. Every person he spoke to had nothing but praise for Samuel Blackwood and his contributions to the community. The judge's own investigation tools, purchased from Blackwood's store to replace items damaged during his journey, began to malfunction in ways that obscured rather than revealed evidence. By the time the judge left Cedar Falls, he had not only cleared the town of any suspicion, but had written a glowing report recommending it as a model for rural development. He had no memory of the strange dreams that had plagued him during his stay, dreams filled with whispered voices and shadowy figures that seemed to emerge from the very walls of his hotel room. The Cedar Falls model was replicated across the region with mechanical precision. The Tollivers had learned to identify communities on the brink of economic collapse, places where hope had grown so thin that any salvation would be welcomed without question. They would send in operatives like Samuel Blackwood, individuals who had undergone years of preparation to become perfect neighbors, trusted friends, and pillars of the community. Each operative carried with them a collection of items that had been prepared in the Tollivers' hidden workshops. These objects were not simply enchanted in the crude sense that folklore might suggest. Instead, they were the products of a sophisticated understanding of human psychology, combined with techniques that seemed to blur the line between science and something far more ancient. The workshops themselves were marvels of dark ingenuity. Located in caves and abandoned mines throughout the Appalachian region, they were staffed by individuals who had been inducted into the Tolliver methods through processes that stripped away their individual will while enhancing their technical abilities. These workers, known within the organization as the devoted, labored continuously to produce the tools of influence that would be distributed through the network of stores and businesses. The process by which ordinary objects were transformed into instruments of control was closely guarded, known only to the most senior members of the Tolliver bloodline. It involved exposing items to specific combinations of minerals found only in certain mountain caves, subjecting them to temperature variations that followed patterns based on lunar cycles, and treating them with compounds derived from plants that grew exclusively in soil that had been saturated with human blood. More disturbing was the role of the devoted in this process. Each object required direct contact with individuals who had undergone the complete dissolution of their personal identity. The devoted would handle items for hours at a time, their own diminished consciousness somehow transferring into the objects a quality that made them irresistible to normal human psychology. The effects were subtle but profound. A hammer purchased from a Tolliver-controlled store would drive nails with unusual precision, but the carpenter using it would find his thoughts gradually aligning with Tolliver interests. A woman's mirror would reflect her image with exceptional clarity, but she would also begin to see things in her peripheral vision, fleeting glimpses of figures that would later appear in her dreams, offering guidance and suggestions. The network grew exponentially throughout the 1910s and 1920s. By 1925, the Tollivers controlled businesses in over 40 communities across Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, and West Virginia. Their influence had become so pervasive that entire regions operated according to their hidden agenda without the inhabitants having any conscious awareness of their manipulation. This period saw the emergence of what historians would later call the Tolliver prosperity, a remarkable economic boom in areas of Appalachia that had previously been mired in poverty. Towns that had been dying suddenly flourished, their populations growing as people moved to take advantage of opportunities that seemed to appear from nowhere. Agricultural yields increased dramatically. Mining operations discovered new veins of coal and precious metals, and small businesses thrived in ways that defied economic logic. Yet prosperity came with a price that few recognized. The enhanced success experienced by those living in Tolliver-influenced communities was entirely dependent upon maintaining behaviors that served the family's larger purposes. Farmers who had experienced miraculous crop yields found that deviating from certain unspoken rules would result in immediate and devastating failures. Miners who had discovered rich veins of coal would find their tunnels collapsing if they failed to follow specific rituals that had been subtly introduced into their daily routines. The psychological impact was even more profound. Residents of Tolliver-controlled towns reported unusually vivid dreams, often featuring the same recurring figures and themes. These dreams served as a form of mass communication, allowing the Tollivers to disseminate instructions and maintain control over vast populations without direct contact. People would wake from these dreams with new ideas, sudden insights, or irresistible urges that aligned perfectly with Tolliver objectives. Children born in these communities exhibited unusual characteristics from an early age. They demonstrated exceptional intelligence and creativity, but only when applying these abilities to tasks that served the greater network. They also showed an uncanny ability to sense deception and manipulation, except when it originated from sources connected to the Tolliver influence. This selective blindness ensured that each new generation would be even more thoroughly integrated into the system than their parents. The Tollivers had also developed methods for dealing with individuals who proved resistant to their influence. These problem cases were handled through a process called adjustment, which involved exposing the individual to increasingly intense forms of the same techniques used to prepare objects and spaces. The process was conducted in specially prepared chambers located beneath apparently ordinary buildings in each controlled community. Those who underwent adjustment emerged as model citizens, their previous resistance replaced by enthusiastic cooperation. However, the transformation came at a terrible cost. Adjusted individuals retained their memories and personalities, but their capacity for independent thought had been severely compromised. They could function normally in most situations, but when faced with choices that might conflict with Tolliver interests, they would experience severe physical and psychological distress. The adjustment process itself was a closely guarded secret, known only to senior family members and a select few of the devoted. It involved techniques that seemed to directly alter the subject's neurological responses, creating new pathways that made resistance to Tolliver influence physically impossible. The process was refined continuously, with each iteration becoming more effective and leaving fewer traces of the manipulation. By 1930, the Tolliver network had achieved a level of sophistication that allowed it to influence regional politics and economics on a scale that would have been unimaginable to the crude mountain clan of the previous century. They had members in state legislatures, federal agencies, and major corporations. Their influence extended into universities, where researchers unknowingly conducted studies that supported Tolliver objectives, and into religious organizations, where ministers preached sermons that had been subtly shaped by Tolliver theology. The family had also developed international connections, establishing trade relationships with organizations in Europe and Asia that shared their interest in techniques of mass psychological control. These exchanges allowed them to refine their methods further, incorporating approaches that had been developed in other cultures and adapting them to their specific needs. Yet even as their power grew, the Tollivers remained true to their fundamental nature. They continued to demand tribute from the communities they controlled, though this tribute had evolved far beyond the crude extraction of resources that had characterized their earlier operations. Now they harvested something far more valuable: the collective psychic energy of entire populations. This energy was gathered through a network of collection points, locations where the concentrated influence of multiple communities could be channeled and stored. These points were typically disguised as ordinary buildings, churches, schools, or community centers, but their true purpose was to serve as conduits for the systematic draining of human vitality and independence. The harvested energy was used to fuel the Tollivers' most ambitious projects, endeavors that would have been impossible through conventional means. They were working toward goals that extended far beyond regional control, seeking to establish a form of influence that could reshape human civilization itself. Their ultimate vision was a world where the boundary between manipulation and natural order had been completely erased, where their control was so thorough that it would be indistinguishable from the natural functioning of society. The scope of their ambition was matched only by their patience. They understood that true transformation required generations, that the kind of control they sought could not be imposed through force, but had to be grown organically through careful cultivation of human dependency and desire. They were willing to wait decades for their plans to mature, secure in the knowledge that each passing year brought them closer to their ultimate objective. The Tolliver influence had become like a virus, spreading through social networks and establishing itself so deeply in the fabric of communities that removing it would require destroying the very structures that held those communities together. They had achieved something that no tyrant or conqueror had ever accomplished. They had made their victims grateful for their subjugation, convinced that their loss of freedom was actually a form of liberation. The true horror of the Tolliver system lay not in its cruelty, but in its efficiency. They had learned to transform human beings into willing instruments of their own enslavement, creating a form of control that was self-perpetuating and virtually undetectable. The people living under their influence genuinely believed themselves to be free, even as every aspect of their lives served purposes they could not begin to comprehend. The scattered remnants of the Tolliver bloodline did not simply vanish into obscurity after the Great Fire of 1892. Instead, they evolved, adapting their methods to the changing world while maintaining their core obsession with control and dominance. What emerged from those ashes was something far more insidious than their previous incarnation, a network of influence that would spread across the continent like a plague of whispers. By the dawn of the 20th century, the surviving Tollivers had learned the art of invisibility. No longer did they operate from fortified compounds or announce their presence with carved dolls and mass murders. Instead, they became the shadows behind legitimate enterprises, the silent partners in ventures that shaped entire regions. Their children were educated in the finest schools, their names scrubbed clean of any connection to the family's violent past. The first sign of their resurgence came in the form of charitable foundations. The Tolliver Educational Trust, established in 1903, began funding schools throughout Appalachia. Their curriculum appeared progressive, emphasizing critical thinking and community service. However, former students would later report strange gaps in their memories, periods where they couldn't recall specific lessons or activities. Those who tried to investigate these missing hours found themselves plagued by nightmares so vivid they seemed more real than waking life. The Trust's teaching methods incorporated what they called experiential learning. Students would participate in overnight retreats at remote locations, returning with a newfound sense of purpose and an inexplicable loyalty to their benefactors. Parents noticed their children's personalities shifting subtly, becoming more compliant, more eager to please authority figures. When questioned, the students would smile blankly and speak of wonderful experiences they couldn't quite describe. By 1910, the Tolliver influence had infiltrated the timber industry through a series of shell companies. The Appalachian Forest Consortium controlled logging rights across 6 states, but their harvesting patterns defied economic logic. Certain groves were left untouched despite containing valuable timber, while others were clear-cut with ruthless efficiency. Local wildlife began exhibiting strange behaviors in the preserved areas, with hunters reporting encounters with animals that seemed to watch them with human-like intelligence. The consortium's workers spoke in hushed tones of the protected groves, where equipment would malfunction without explanation and compasses would spin wildly. Some claimed to have seen figures moving between the trees, always just beyond clear sight. These sightings coincided with a disturbing trend among the logging crews. Men who worked near the preserved areas would begin speaking in their sleep, reciting words and languages that linguists couldn't identify. Their families reported that these nocturnal recitations would synchronize across the entire work camp, creating an eerie chorus that echoed through the mountains. The family's most ambitious project began in 1915 with the establishment of the Tolliver Medical Research Institute. Ostensibly dedicated to combating the diseases that plagued rural communities, the institute attracted brilliant minds from across the country. Their research into what they termed psychosomatic medicine produced remarkable results, with patients reporting miraculous recoveries from conditions that had baffled other physicians. However, the Institute's true purpose became apparent through the testimonies of former patients who managed to escape their influence. The treatments involved extended stays at remote facilities where patients underwent procedures that went far beyond conventional medicine. Survivors described sessions where they were connected to strange apparatus while doctors monitored their brain activity. These procedures allegedly allowed the Tollivers to map the neurological pathways associated with willpower and independent thought. The Institute's research culminated in the development of what they called therapeutic resonance. By exposing patients to specific combinations of sound, light, and electromagnetic frequencies, they could induce states of profound suggestibility. Patients would emerge from these sessions with their symptoms cured, but their personalities fundamentally altered. They became living advertisements for the Institute's methods, spreading word of their miraculous recoveries while unconsciously recruiting new patients. The Tolliver network expanded into the realm of entertainment during the 1920s. The Harmony Broadcasting Company emerged as a major force in the new medium of radio, producing programming that captivated audiences across the nation. Their shows featured hypnotic musical arrangements and storytelling techniques that seemed to bypass conscious thought, speaking directly to the subconscious mind. Radio families would gather around their sets each evening, drawn by programming that somehow felt essential to their daily routines. The shows featured recurring themes of community cooperation, the importance of trusting authority, and the dangers of questioning established order. Listeners reported that the programs helped them feel more connected to their communities, though they couldn't explain exactly how. The company's most popular program, Voices from the Valley, featured folk tales and local legends from Appalachian communities. However, these stories were subtly altered versions of genuine folklore, modified to include specific psychological triggers. The narratives would plant suggestions about the natural order of society, the virtue of submission to wise leadership, and the terrible consequences faced by those who challenged traditional hierarchies. As the influence of Harmony Broadcasting grew, communities within its reach began exhibiting remarkable social cohesion. Crime rates plummeted, labor disputes became virtually non-existent, and civic participation reached unprecedented levels. Sociologists studying these communities found populations that appeared almost too perfect, with residents displaying an unsettling uniformity of thought and behavior. The Great Depression provided the Tollivers with their greatest opportunity yet. As traditional institutions crumbled and desperate people sought salvation, the family's network of charitable organizations, medical facilities, and media outlets positioned them as benevolent saviors. The Tolliver Relief Foundation distributed aid to struggling communities, but this assistance came with strings attached that recipients didn't fully understand. Relief recipients were required to attend orientation sessions where they learned about proper resource management and community responsibility. These sessions employed the same psychological techniques developed by the Medical Institute, creating a sense of profound gratitude and obligation among participants. Communities that accepted Tolliver aid found themselves increasingly dependent on the Foundation's guidance for decision-making, gradually surrendering their autonomy in exchange for continued support. The Foundation's most insidious program was the Community Health Initiative, which provided free medical care to rural populations. Patients who received treatment reported feeling better than they had in years, but they also developed an inexplicable need to return to the clinics regularly. These return visits weren't for medical procedures, but for what staff termed wellness consultations, sessions where patients would sit in comfortable chairs while listening to specially designed audio recordings. The recordings allegedly contained binaural beats and subliminal messaging designed to enhance the psychological conditioning begun during the initial treatment. Patients would leave these sessions feeling refreshed and optimistic, but also more susceptible to suggestion and less likely to question authority. Entire communities became dependent on these wellness sessions, with residents exhibiting withdrawal symptoms if they missed their scheduled appointments. By the 1930s, the Tolliver network had evolved into a sophisticated system of social control that operated through seemingly legitimate channels. Their influence extended into government agencies, law enforcement, educational institutions, and religious organizations. Officials within these institutions weren't necessarily conscious collaborators, but rather individuals who had been gradually conditioned to support policies that served Tolliver interests. The family's political influence manifested through the American Unity Party, a grassroots movement that promoted traditional values and community solidarity. The party's platform appeared moderate and reasonable, emphasizing the importance of social stability and the dangers of radical change. However, their definition of stability involved the systematic suppression of independent thought and the concentration of power in the hands of approved leaders. The party's candidates won elections at local and state levels throughout regions where Tolliver influence was strongest. These officials implemented policies that appeared beneficial on the surface but contained hidden mechanisms for population control. Educational curricula were modified to emphasize conformity and respect for authority. Mental health programs were expanded, but they utilized treatment methods developed by the Tolliver Medical Research Institute. The family's crowning achievement was the establishment of the National Wellness Survey in 1938. Presented as a public health initiative, the survey collected detailed psychological profiles of millions of Americans under the guise of understanding mental health needs. The data gathered allowed the Tollivers to identify individuals who might resist their influence and communities that weren't yet under their control. The survey's questionnaires were designed to reveal not just psychological vulnerabilities, but also social connections and influence patterns. Respondents who demonstrated leadership potential or independent thinking were flagged for special attention. These individuals would subsequently encounter opportunities that seemed too good to pass up, jobs with organizations connected to the Tolliver network, scholarships to schools under their influence, or invitations to participate in prestigious programs. Those who accepted these opportunities found themselves gradually drawn into the family's web of influence. The process was so subtle that most never realized they were being manipulated. They would advance in their careers, gain respect in their communities, and assume positions of authority while unconsciously serving Tolliver interests. Their success became a form of psychological leverage, making them reluctant to question the system that had elevated them. The outbreak of World War II provided the Tollivers with unprecedented opportunities to expand their influence. The family's network of businesses secured lucrative government contracts. Their medical facilities treated wounded veterans, and their media outlets shaped public opinion about the war effort. The chaos and uncertainty of wartime made populations more receptive to authoritarian solutions and more willing to sacrifice individual freedoms for collective security. The Tolliver War Relief Organization became a major provider of services to military families, offering everything from financial assistance to psychological counseling. However, these services came with the same conditioning elements that characterized all Tolliver programs. Military families who received aid found themselves becoming advocates for expanded government authority and reduced civil liberties, believing these changes were necessary for national security. The organization's most significant program was the Veteran Reintegration Initiative, which helped returning soldiers adjust to civilian life. Veterans who participated in the program reported feeling more confident and optimistic about their futures, but they also developed a strong aversion to political dissent and social upheaval. These conditioned veterans became influential voices in their communities, promoting the stability and order that the Tollivers valued above all else. The post-war period saw the Tolliver network reach new heights of sophistication. The family's influence had become so pervasive that it was virtually invisible, woven into the fabric of American society like a hidden operating system. Their methods had evolved beyond direct psychological manipulation to encompass what they termed environmental conditioning, the systematic modification of social and physical environments to promote desired behaviors. The Tolliver Housing Development Corporation became a major player in the post-war suburban boom, constructing planned communities that appeared to represent the American dream. These developments featured attractive homes, well-maintained parks, and excellent schools, but they also incorporated subtle design elements intended to influence resident behavior. Street layouts discouraged gatherings that might lead to political organizing. Public spaces were designed to promote passive activities rather than active engagement, and architectural features subtly reinforced hierarchical social structures. Residents of Tolliver developments reported high levels of satisfaction with their communities, but they also exhibited remarkably uniform political attitudes and social behaviors. These communities became showcases of American prosperity and social harmony, attracting visitors from around the world who wanted to understand the secret of their success. The secret, of course, was the systematic application of psychological conditioning on an unprecedented scale. The family's influence extended into the emerging medium of television through the Pinnacle Broadcasting Network. Their programming appeared wholesome and family-oriented, featuring shows that promoted traditional values and social stability. However, these programs incorporated advanced psychological techniques developed over decades of research using specific color palettes, camera angles, and editing rhythms to induce desired mental states in viewers. The network's most popular show, Main Street USA, depicted an idealized American community where problems were always solved through cooperation and respect for authority. The show's narratives consistently reinforced the message that individual desires should be subordinated to collective needs, and that questioning established institutions was both dangerous and unnecessary. Families who watched the show regularly reported feeling more satisfied with their lives and more trusting of government and corporate authority. By the 1950s, the Tolliver Network had achieved something unprecedented in human history: the creation of a vast population that had been conditioned to participate willingly in its own subjugation. Millions of Americans lived lives that appeared free and prosperous while actually serving the interests of a family that most had never heard of. The Tollivers had learned that the most effective form of control was the kind that felt like freedom. The family's ultimate achievement was the establishment of the American Consensus Institute, a think tank that shaped public policy across the nation. The Institute's research appeared objective and scientific, but it was designed to support conclusions that served Tolliver interests. Their recommendations influenced everything from educational policy to urban planning, consistently promoting approaches that increased social control while maintaining the appearance of democratic governance. The Institute's most significant contribution was the development of what they called participatory compliance theory. This framework suggested that people were most likely to accept authority when they felt they had participated in choosing their leaders and shaping their communities. The theory provided a roadmap for creating the illusion of democratic participation while ensuring that real power remained concentrated in the hands of those who understood how to manipulate public opinion. The Tolliver legacy had evolved from the crude violence of their 19th century origins into something far more sophisticated and dangerous. They had learned that the most effective tyranny was the kind that convinced its victims they were free. Their influence had become so pervasive that it was virtually impossible to escape, woven into the very fabric of modern society like a virus that had learned to hide within the host's own immune system. The family's network continued to expand and evolve, adapting to new technologies and social changes while maintaining their core commitment to control and dominance. They had created a system that could perpetuate itself across generations, ensuring that their influence would continue long after the original family members had passed away. The Tolliver name might fade from memory, but their methods would live on, passed down through institutions and practices that had become indistinguishable from normal society. The true horror of the Tolliver legacy wasn't the violence of their early years, but the subtle perfection of their later methods. They had learned to make slavery feel like freedom, to make conformity feel like choice, and to make surrender feel like victory. Their greatest achievement was convincing their victims that they were the authors of their own oppression, willing participants in a system that served interests they couldn't even perceive. The winter of 1923 brought more than just brutal cold to the Appalachian regions. It brought a shift in how the Tolliver family operated, a deadly evolution that would transform their crude beginnings into something far more sophisticated and terrifying. While other mountain clans remained trapped in cycles of simple violence and feuds, the Tollivers began to understand something profound about human nature. They discovered that true power wasn't wielded through fear alone, but through the systematic erosion of free will itself. The family's transformation began with what they called the Great Refinement, a period spanning from 1923 to 1935, when the third generation of Tollivers, led by the calculating Marcus Tolliver, recognized that their traditional methods of wooden dolls and intimidation tactics were becoming obsolete. Law enforcement was modernizing, federal agents were venturing deeper into mountain territories, and the old ways of controlling communities through brute force were drawing unwanted attention. Marcus possessed an intellect that his predecessors lacked. He had secretly attended university under an assumed name, studying psychology, sociology, and what would later become known as mass communication theory. Upon returning to the family compound in 1923, he initiated a radical restructuring of their operations. No longer would they be merely a clan of mountain thugs. They would become architects of human consciousness itself. The first phase of their evolution involved what Marcus termed as environmental conditioning. Rather than threatening individuals directly, the Tollivers began subtly manipulating the physical and social environments of entire communities. They would move into a region slowly, purchasing businesses, funding local improvements, and establishing themselves as benefactors rather than threats. A new school would be built with Tolliver funding, complete with carefully selected teachers who had been either recruited or coerced into the family's service. These educators weren't merely corrupt officials taking bribes. They were practitioners of what the Tollivers called cognitive architecture, the deliberate shaping of young minds through seemingly innocent curriculum modifications. Children would learn mathematics using word problems that subtly reinforced concepts of hierarchy and obedience. History lessons would emphasize the importance of strong leadership and the dangers of questioning authority. Literature classes would focus on stories where rebellion led to tragedy and conformity brought prosperity. The genius of this approach lay in its invisibility. Parents saw their children receiving excellent educations, communities witnessed unprecedented prosperity, and local officials celebrated their good fortune in attracting such generous benefactors. Meanwhile, an entire generation was being systematically programmed to accept the Tolliver worldview as natural and inevitable. The family's religious manipulation proved even more insidious. Rather than opposing existing churches, they infiltrated them. Tolliver operatives would arrive in communities as seemingly devout individuals, eventually working their way into positions of influence within congregations. They would subtly alter sermons, suggesting that temporal authority was divinely ordained, that questioning community leaders was tantamount to questioning God Himself. New religious traditions would be introduced, always presented as ancient practices being restored. Community gatherings would include rituals that appeared to be harmless celebrations, but were actually sophisticated psychological conditioning exercises. Participants would find themselves engaging in group activities that broke down individual identity and reinforced collective thinking. The line between religious worship and psychological manipulation became impossible to discern. The Tolliver compound itself underwent massive expansion during this period. What had once been a collection of crude mountain cabins became a sprawling complex that resembled a cross between a university campus and a corporate headquarters. The family constructed laboratories where they experimented with early forms of what would later be recognized as mind control technology. They studied the effects of specific sound frequencies on human behavior, developed chemical compounds that could induce states of heightened suggestibility, and created environmental modifications that could influence mood and decision-making on a subconscious level. Perhaps most disturbing was their development of what they called the dependency matrix. This was a systematic approach to making communities reliant on Tolliver resources and guidance for their basic needs. They would identify key infrastructure elements, economic drivers, and social institutions within a target area, then gradually position themselves as indispensable to the functioning of each system. A community's water supply would experience mysterious contamination, leading to the need for expensive filtration systems that only Tolliver-controlled companies could provide. Local businesses would face a series of unfortunate accidents or market pressures that could only be resolved through Tolliver intervention. Social problems would emerge that required the expertise of Tolliver-trained counselors and administrators to address. The result was communities that became completely dependent on the Tolliver family for their survival and prosperity, yet the residents genuinely believed they were living in the most free and prosperous places in America. They had been conditioned to see their dependence as independence, their manipulation as liberation, their control as choice. By 1935, the Tolliver operation had expanded far beyond the Appalachian Mountains. They had established subsidiary operations in major cities across the eastern United States, each disguised as legitimate businesses, charitable organizations, or academic institutions. Their network included hundreds of operatives who had been recruited through a combination of financial incentives, psychological manipulation, and carefully orchestrated life crises that left individuals vulnerable to Tolliver influence. The family's most ambitious project during this period was the creation of what they called generational programming. This involved identifying families with young children and implementing multi-decade plans to shape entire bloodlines according to Tolliver specifications. Children would be guided toward specific career paths, encouraged to marry particular partners, and steered toward life decisions that would ultimately serve the family's broader agenda. These programs were so sophisticated that the targets themselves never realized they were being manipulated. A young man would believe he had chosen his career in journalism based on his natural interests and aptitudes, never suspecting that his childhood experiences had been carefully orchestrated to create those very interests. A woman would feel she had found true love with her spouse, unaware that their meeting had been arranged and their compatibility had been artificially enhanced through subtle psychological conditioning. The Tolliver family's approach to violence also evolved during this period. Rather than relying on direct physical intimidation, they developed what they called precision targeting. Individuals who posed threats to their operations would experience a series of seemingly unrelated misfortunes. Their careers would stagnate due to mysterious professional setbacks. Their relationships would deteriorate due to inexplicable personal conflicts. Their health would decline due to stress-related conditions that appeared entirely natural. In the rare cases where more direct action was necessary, the Tollivers employed methods that left no evidence of foul play. They had developed extensive knowledge of poisons that mimicked natural diseases, accident scenarios that appeared completely random, and psychological pressure techniques that could drive individuals to suicide while leaving behind evidence of pre-existing mental health issues. The family's financial operations became equally sophisticated. They established a complex network of shell companies, charitable foundations, and investment vehicles that allowed them to move money across state and national borders without detection. Their funding came from a combination of legitimate business profits, carefully orchestrated insurance frauds, and what amounted to a tribute system where communities under their influence would contribute to Tolliver coffers through inflated prices for essential services. By the mid 1930s, the Tolliver family had essentially created a shadow government that operated parallel to official American institutions. They had their own intelligence network, their own enforcement mechanisms, their own economic system, and their own educational and religious institutions. Yet all of this existed invisibly, hidden beneath the veneer of normal American life. The most chilling aspect of their operation was how successfully they had convinced their victims that they were living in freedom. Communities under Tolliver control genuinely believed they were experiencing unprecedented prosperity and social harmony. Individuals who had been programmed from childhood to serve Tolliver interests felt they were pursuing their own dreams and ambitions. The family had achieved something that traditional tyrants could only dream of, a form of control so complete that it was indistinguishable from voluntary compliance. The Tolliver legacy from this period established the foundation for everything that would follow. They had proven that human consciousness could be systematically engineered, that entire populations could be controlled without their awareness, and that the most effective tyranny was one that convinced its victims they were free. This understanding would guide their operations for decades to come, as they continued to refine their techniques and expand their influence across American society. The transformation of the Tolliver family from crude mountain outlaws to sophisticated social engineers represented one of the most significant and terrifying developments in American history. They had discovered the ultimate secret of power, not just the ability to control what people did, but the ability to control what they thought and felt and believed. In doing so, they had created a form of oppression so subtle and pervasive that it became nearly impossible to detect, let alone resist. By the mid-20th century, the Tolliver influence had evolved beyond simple manipulation into something far more insidious. They no longer needed to terrorize communities or leave calling cards. Their power had become self-sustaining, woven into the very fabric of society, like a virus that had learned to hide within healthy tissue. What emerged was perhaps the most frightening aspect of their legacy, a system so deeply embedded that it appeared completely natural, even beneficial. The transition began in the 1940s when the family recognized that crude control methods were becoming obsolete. Modern communication, federal oversight, and changing social structures required a more sophisticated approach. They needed to become invisible while maintaining absolute influence. The solution came from an unexpected source: their own children. Unlike previous generations who were raised in isolation and trained through brutal initiation rituals, the new generation of Tollivers were sent to prestigious universities, integrated into mainstream society, and taught to blend seamlessly with the American elite. They studied psychology, sociology, economics, and political science not just to understand these fields, but to weaponize them. These educated Tollivers became the architects of what they called the Great Weaving, a systematic infiltration of every institution that shaped human behavior. The process was methodical and patient. Tolliver descendants took positions in universities, gradually influencing curriculum and research. They established think tanks that produced studies supporting their agenda while discrediting opposition. They funded political campaigns across the spectrum, ensuring influence regardless of electoral outcomes. Most crucially, they recognized that true power lay not in controlling leaders, but in shaping the systems that produced leaders. Their methods became increasingly subtle and psychological. Rather than forcing compliance through fear, they created environments where their desired behaviors seemed natural and beneficial. They pioneered techniques that would later be recognized as social engineering, using carefully crafted incentives and social pressures to guide decision-making without the targets realizing they were being manipulated. The media became their most powerful tool. The Tollivers didn't simply buy newspapers or television stations outright. Instead, they created complex webs of ownership through shell companies and investment funds, ensuring their influence while maintaining plausible deniability. They understood that controlling information was more effective than controlling territory. By shaping narratives, they could influence public opinion on a massive scale, making their agenda appear to be the natural will of the people. Educational institutions proved equally valuable. The Tollivers established scholarship programs, endowed chairs, and funded research projects that gradually shifted academic discourse in their favor. They realized that by influencing what was taught in schools and universities, they could shape the worldview of entire generations. Students graduated believing they had formed their own opinions, unaware that their fundamental assumptions had been carefully cultivated. The family's approach to religion was particularly sophisticated. Rather than opposing established faiths, they infiltrated them, funding theological seminaries and supporting religious leaders who promoted interpretations favorable to their goals. They understood that spiritual authority carried unique power, and by subtly influencing religious doctrine, they could shape moral frameworks that supported their agenda while appearing divinely inspired. Corporate America became another vector for their influence. The Tollivers invested heavily in companies across multiple industries, not necessarily for profit, but for control. They pioneered the use of corporate culture as a tool of social engineering, creating workplace environments that promoted specific values and behaviors. Employees at Tolliver-influenced companies unknowingly became agents of their agenda, carrying these values into their communities and families. The psychological techniques they developed were remarkably advanced for their time. They understood that direct commands created resistance, while subtle suggestions embedded in apparently neutral contexts were readily accepted. They used environmental psychology to design spaces that promoted desired behaviors, social psychology to create group dynamics that reinforced their messages, and behavioral economics to structure choices that led people toward predetermined outcomes. Their influence extended into urban planning and architecture. The Tollivers quietly funded development projects that shaped how communities were built. They understood that physical environments profoundly influenced social behavior and mental states. Neighborhoods designed according to their principles fostered isolation, dependency, and conformity while appearing to promote prosperity and safety. The family's most insidious innovation was what they called emotional conditioning. They developed techniques for associating specific feelings with particular ideas or behaviors, creating powerful psychological triggers that could be activated through media, advertising, or social interactions. People would experience strong positive or negative emotions in response to certain concepts without understanding why, making them easy to manipulate through carefully crafted messaging. By the 1960s, the Tolliver system had achieved a level of sophistication that bordered on the supernatural. They had created feedback loops where their influence reinforced itself, becoming stronger with each generation. Children raised in Tolliver-influenced environments grew up to support policies and leaders that furthered the family's agenda, believing they were acting on their own convictions. The family's approach to conflict was equally sophisticated. Rather than directly opposing their enemies, they used psychological manipulation to turn opponents against each other. They became masters of creating artificial divisions, funding both sides of controversies to ensure chaos and preventing any unified opposition to their rule. Social movements that appeared to challenge their authority were often secretly guided by their agents, channeling dissent into harmless directions. Their control of information allowed them to shape historical narratives, ensuring that their role in events was either erased or reframed as beneficial. They funded historians, journalists, and documentary filmmakers who presented versions of events that supported their interests. Alternative interpretations were marginalized or discredited, creating a false consensus around their preferred version of reality. The Tollivers also recognized the power of scientific authority. They funded research that supported their goals while suppressing studies that challenged them. They understood that by controlling what was considered scientifically valid, they could shape policy and public opinion on a massive scale. Environmental studies, medical research, and social science all became tools for advancing their agenda while appearing objective and neutral. Their influence on popular culture was particularly effective. The family quietly funded entertainment productions that promoted their values and worldview. Movies, television shows, music, and literature all carried subtle messages that shaped public consciousness. Audiences absorbed these messages as entertainment, unaware that they were being systematically programmed to accept specific beliefs and behaviors. The technology sector became their newest frontier. As computers and digital communications emerged, the Tollivers immediately recognized their potential for surveillance and control. They invested heavily in technology companies, not just for profit, but for access to the vast amounts of personal data these systems collected. They understood that information about individual behavior patterns could be used to predict and manipulate future actions with unprecedented precision. Their approach to governance evolved to match their sophisticated methods. Rather than seeking direct political control, they created systems of influence that worked regardless of who held office. They funded policy research organizations that provided ready-made solutions to emerging problems, ensuring that their preferred approaches appeared to be the natural response to current events. The family's most remarkable achievement was making their control system appear to be freedom itself. They created environments where people believed they were making independent choices while actually following predetermined paths. Markets appeared free while being carefully manipulated. Elections seemed democratic while offering only pre-approved options. Media appeared diverse while carrying the same underlying messages. By the 1970s, the Tolliver influence had become so pervasive that it was virtually invisible. Their agenda had been internalized by millions of people who genuinely believed they were acting according to their own values and interests. The family had achieved the ultimate form of power, control that was both absolute and unrecognizable as control. They had created a world where their tyranny masqueraded as liberty, their manipulation appeared as natural order, and their ancient hunger for domination had been transformed into a self-perpetuating system that fed on the very people it claimed to serve. The horror of the Tolliver legacy lay not in dramatic acts of violence or obvious oppression, but in the systematic erosion of human autonomy disguised as progress and prosperity. They had achieved what no dictator or conqueror had ever accomplished: the complete subjugation of free will while maintaining the illusion of freedom. Their victims thanked them for their enslavement, their subjects celebrated their own manipulation, and their empire expanded through the voluntary participation of those it consumed. By the 1990s, the Tolliver network had evolved beyond mere control into something far more insidious: total integration. They had become the very fabric of modern American society, their influence so thoroughly woven into daily life that resistance wasn't just futile, it was inconceivable. The old methods of fear and brutality had given way to something infinitely more sophisticated and terrifying: willing participation in one's own enslavement. The technological revolution of the late 20th century provided the Tollivers with their most powerful tool yet. While other families struggled to adapt to the digital age, the Tollivers had been preparing for this moment for decades. They understood that information was the ultimate weapon, and they positioned themselves at the nexus of America's emerging digital infrastructure. Through a web of shell companies and proxy investors, they acquired stakes in telecommunications giants, software developers, and hardware manufacturers. Their influence extended into the very circuits and code that powered the nation's computers. Every email sent, every website visited, every digital transaction conducted, all of it flowed through systems they monitored and controlled. The genius of their approach lay in its subtlety. They didn't need to read every message or track every purchase. Instead, they focused on patterns, on the aggregate behavior of populations. They studied how information moved through communities, how opinions formed and spread, how consumer desires could be manufactured and directed. The individual was less important than the collective, and the collective could be shaped through careful manipulation of the information ecosystem. Social media platforms became their laboratories. Long before the general public understood the psychological implications of algorithmic content curation, the Tollivers were perfecting the art of digital influence. They didn't own these platforms outright. That would have been too obvious. Instead, they placed their people in key positions within the companies, influenced the development of recommendation algorithms, and subtly shaped the very architecture of online discourse. The beauty of social media was that it made surveillance voluntary. People eagerly shared their thoughts, emotions, relationships, and daily activities, creating detailed psychological profiles that would have taken the Tollivers decades to compile through traditional means. Better yet, the platforms created addiction-like engagement patterns, keeping users scrolling, clicking, and sharing in endless cycles of dopamine-driven behavior. The Tollivers understood that the human mind was not equipped to handle the constant stream of information that digital technology provided. They exploited this weakness ruthlessly, using sophisticated psychological techniques to create states of anxiety, confusion, and dependency. They flooded information channels with contradictory messages, making it impossible for people to distinguish truth from fiction. In this environment of manufactured uncertainty, people became more susceptible to suggestion and more dependent on authority figures to provide clarity. Their influence extended into every aspect of digital life. The search engines that people used to find information were subtly biased to promote certain viewpoints while suppressing others. The news algorithms that determined what stories people saw were designed to amplify division and conflict. The advertising systems that tracked users across the internet were used not just to sell products, but to identify psychological vulnerabilities and exploit them for broader control purposes. The Tollivers recognized that traditional political systems were becoming obsolete in the digital age. Why control a few politicians when you could influence millions of voters directly? They pioneered techniques of micro-targeting, using vast databases of personal information to craft individualized messages that would resonate with specific psychological profiles. They could make a single political candidate appear completely different to different audiences, each seeing exactly what they wanted to see. But politics was just one application of their broader strategy. They used the same techniques to influence consumer behavior, shaping everything from fashion trends to food preferences to lifestyle choices. They could create artificial scarcity for products, manufacture social movements, and even influence religious beliefs through careful manipulation of online communities. The pharmaceutical industry provided another avenue for control. The Tollivers had long understood the power of chemical influence, dating back to their early experiments with mind-altering substances. In the modern era, they helped shape a medical system that normalized the use of psychoactive drugs for an ever-expanding range of conditions. Depression, anxiety, attention disorders all became opportunities to chemically alter brain function in ways that made people more compliant and less capable of independent thought. They were particularly interested in medications that affected children. By influencing diagnostic criteria and treatment protocols, they ensured that millions of young people would grow up with altered brain chemistry, making them more susceptible to digital manipulation and less capable of sustained attention or critical thinking. The education system, already under their influence, became a pipeline for identifying and medicating potential resistors. The Tollivers also recognized the importance of physical infrastructure in the digital age. They invested heavily in the data centers that powered the internet, the cellular towers that enabled mobile communication, and the fiber optic cables that carried information around the world. By controlling the physical layer of the digital ecosystem, they could monitor, modify, or interrupt communications at will. Their influence extended into the realm of artificial intelligence and machine learning. As these technologies became more sophisticated, the Tollivers ensured that they would be designed to serve their purposes. They funded research into behavioral prediction algorithms, automated influence systems, and digital agents that could interact with humans in increasingly sophisticated ways. The goal was to create a digital environment that could anticipate and shape human behavior more effectively than humans themselves. The concept of privacy became one of their most powerful tools. By framing digital surveillance as a trade off between security and privacy, they made people complicit in their own monitoring. The majority of the population willingly carried tracking devices, their smartphones, that provided real time location data, communication patterns, and behavioral information. They accepted terms of service agreements that gave companies unprecedented access to their personal information, all in exchange for the convenience of digital services. The Tollivers understood that the key to maintaining control in the digital age was to make resistance technologically impossible. They worked to create digital dependencies that were so fundamental to modern life that opting out would mean complete social and economic isolation. Banking, employment, healthcare, education, entertainment all became increasingly dependent on digital systems that they controlled. They also recognized the importance of generational change. Older Americans who remembered life before digital technology posed a potential threat to their control. But younger generations, raised in the digital environment from birth, had no conception of privacy, autonomy, or independent thought as their grandparents had understood these concepts. For them, constant surveillance and algorithmic manipulation were simply normal features of existence. The Tollivers' digital empire was designed to be self-perpetuating. The algorithms that controlled information flow were constantly learning and adapting, becoming more effective at manipulation over time. The systems were so complex that no single person could understand how they worked, making it nearly impossible to identify or counter their influence. Even the engineers who built these systems were often unaware of their true purpose, working on small components of a vast machine whose ultimate function remained hidden. By the dawn of the 21st century, the Tollivers had achieved something unprecedented in human history, a form of control that was both totalitarian and invisible. They had created a system where people believed they were free while being more thoroughly controlled than any population in human history. The tools of oppression had become the tools of entertainment, communication, and commerce. Resistance was not just difficult, it was inconceivable to minds that had been shaped from birth to accept digital manipulation as normal. The old Appalachian Mountains, where the Tollivers had first emerged, still stood, but they were no longer the center of their empire. Their true kingdom now existed in the digital realm, in the spaces between servers and the algorithms that governed human behavior. They had transcended their physical origins to become something far more dangerous, a form of power that could reach into every home, every mind, every moment of human existence. The transformation was complete. The violent mountain clan that had once terrorized isolated communities had evolved into the invisible architects of a new form of human civilization, one where freedom was an illusion and control was so total that its subjects celebrated their own enslavement. In achieving this ultimate victory, the Tollivers had become something beyond human. They had become the very structure of modern reality itself. As we reach the end of our journey through the Tolliver family's dark evolution, we must confront the most unsettling truth of all. Their story never truly ended. It simply transformed into something far more insidious than their ancestors could have ever imagined. By the dawn of the 21st century, the Tolliver network had achieved something unprecedented in human history. They had successfully engineered a society that policed itself, regulated its own thoughts, and willingly surrendered its autonomy while believing it was experiencing unprecedented freedom. The crude wooden dolls of their mountain origins had evolved into algorithms that could predict and manipulate human behavior with surgical precision. But their greatest triumph wasn't technological, it was psychological. They had created a world where their victims defended the very systems that enslaved them. People fought passionately to protect the social media platforms that harvested their data, the political systems that ignored their voices, and the economic structures that concentrated wealth into fewer and fewer hands. The Tollivers had weaponized human nature itself, turning our tribal instincts, our need for belonging, and our desire for meaning into tools of control. The most chilling aspect of their final form is how completely they had eliminated the concept of resistance. Traditional tyrannies always created martyrs, heroes who could inspire others to fight back. But the Tollivers had engineered something far more sophisticated, a tyranny that felt like freedom, oppression that masqueraded as choice, and control that appeared as empowerment. Consider the modern world through this lens, the endless scroll of social media that feels like connection but breeds isolation, the political theater that offers the illusion of choice while serving identical masters. The economic system that promises prosperity while delivering servitude, the educational institutions that claim to develop critical thinking while producing conformity. Every aspect of contemporary life bears the fingerprints of their centuries-long manipulation. The Tollivers had become the invisible architects of human civilization itself. They no longer needed to hide in mountain hollows or work through intermediaries. They had become the very fabric of society, woven so deeply into the structure of human existence that removing them would require dismantling civilization itself. Perhaps most terrifying of all is the realization that they may have transcended their human origins entirely. The family that once relied on crude psychological manipulation and environmental conditioning had evolved into something that operated beyond individual consciousness. They had become a self-sustaining system of control that could function without specific human oversight, powered by the collective unconscious of humanity itself. The wooden dolls still exist, of course, but now they're in our pockets, on our desks, in our living rooms. They are the devices we can't put down, the screens we can't look away from, the algorithms we can't escape. The Tollivers had achieved the ultimate victory. They had convinced us to willingly carry our own instruments of control, to cherish them, and to feel lost without them. Their story serves as a warning about the slow erosion of human agency, the gradual surrender of individual will to collective manipulation, and the terrifying possibility that our modern world isn't the result of progress and innovation, but of centuries of careful, deliberate conditioning by forces we can no longer see or understand. The Tollivers won because they understood something fundamental about human nature that we've forgotten. True power isn't about forcing compliance. It's about making people want to comply. They didn't conquer us. They convinced us to conquer ourselves.